From having a shaky start after the Endgame era, to VFXing movies and series like She-Hulk Attorney at Law to Oblivion, this is why the MCU is falling apart. It's no secret that following Endgame's hype was a huge task. Summer 2019 had Marvel fans jumping with joy. Everyone was expecting a grand conclusion to 11 years of world building. And boy, was it insane. That emotion is what the MCU is all about, but right after the fourth phase began, the franchise seemed to lose its way. Maybe the pandemic made everyone look at Marvel films more critically, but there's no denying that its charm is rusting. Now, the fan base seems to be split into two groups. One side feels that they're being given less than ideal content by the franchise, while the other camp resists criticism as though they have some sort of infinity stone to control it. The projects have mostly been released to mixed reviews at best. If you look through Rotten Tomatoes, the critics are done with the characters and the stories. Out of the total 29 films rated online on the website, 4 of the films from Phase 4 rank pretty low. Black Widow got 76%, Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness stood at 74%. Following it, Thor Love and Thunder had 65%, and Eternals got an underwhelming 47%. Do you see where I'm going with this? There's no use just dancing around it. I'll call it what it is. Phase 4 is a massive failure. When the MCU kickstarted about a decade ago, its sole distinguishing feature was novelty. Unique ideas, characters, and stories. The fact that the movies were supposed to be linked to create a connected structure added another layer of intrigue. Sure, it was about superheroes, but there were plenty of ways to make it special. Plus, it hadn't been done before. During Phase 4, the originality that was promised seemed to be wearing off. One after another, the films became more predictable. It was to the point that if you were to ask a critic for an opinion, they'd say something like, "It wasn't great, but it's okay for a Marvel movie." So how did things get here? First off, the characters fell flat. If you look at Tony Stark or Thor, those are characters that symbolize the MCU's energy. They were interesting, had totally unique dynamics, and had satisfying stories. Robert Downey Jr. understood the assignment so well that fans tuned in just to enjoy the initial expectations he had set. His character was portrayed with humor, but the underlying complexity always hit right in the feels, so everyone understood the stakes. It wasn't just fun and games. Chris Evans and Scarlett Johansson also added depth to their characters. If you've been paying attention, that sort of talent has been missing from some of the movies in Phase 4, which leads to the characters not sticking with the viewers like they used to. Even when the characters were interesting and well acted, Phase 4 lacked direction. As the projects were released, the general expectation was that a bigger picture would emerge, but that didn't happen. The individual Marvel pieces didn't quite connect to the larger universe, so the significance of the MCU began to come into question. People didn't know how things were supposed to connect. Granted, it wasn't an easy task. Phase 4 had to build an entirely new narrative that needed to get to a grand event. The problem was, the audience never understood what that plan was. Characters were introduced, but there wasn't much impact. The next great Kong, shown right in the finale of Loki's first season, only showed up once. There have been great characters too, like Yelena Belova, She-Hulk, the Eternals, and Namor. They made the MCU bigger and more interesting, but nothing so far seems to connect them. Maybe you'll say, well, you gotta keep watching to see how it all ties together. At the end of Phase 1, the OG Avengers team had already started to form a team, and by the end of Phase 4, who knows if Moon Knight would even hang out with Shang-Chi? Some of the central characters didn't quite show development. The next great Kang, shown right in the finale of Loki's first season, only showed up once. The continuity of character arcs is important. Take the example of Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness. WandaVision does have a connection with the film because Wanda Maximoff had already been studying the Darkhold. She uses Gargantos to hunt America Chavez because she's already searching for her sons in the multiverse. But when you start to add things up, Wanda's growth in the series is ignored, and she's made out to be this huge villain. With writing like that, the superbly drafted Scarlet Witch arc in the show is watered down and used to further the story of Doctor Strange. Why must a storyline be sacrificed for a story? This doesn't contribute to the connectivity that Marvel is known for. Also, The multiverse of madness happened right after Spider-Man No Way Home, in which the Doctor cast a spell that caused the multiverse to almost melt. An event like that should get a mention in his next film, right? Even if the interference was going to be ignored, the consequences should have been mentioned. It's details like this that make the franchise feel non-committal, and that's never good. Even with new TV series and special presentations, Phase 4 felt disjointed. Let's look at Werewolf by Night. Its story organically comes from the MCU, but doesn't fit into the larger narrative. Also, the movie introduced so many new characters like Jack Russell and Elsa Bloodstone. But the question remains, what's next for them? Phase 4 may have given the world content in a longer format, like through TV shows such as She-Hulk Attorney at Law and Moon Knight. I'll admit, both wrapped up their tales pretty nicely, but that's not what Marvel is about. Nothing about their return was ever made public. In fact, it was so uncertain that the fans don't even know if they will return at all. Now, it's understood that Phase 4 was supposed to mirror Phase 1, so where did things go wrong? Well, for starters, Phase 4 was jam-packed. There's been just way too much content. Here's a simple fact. Phase 1 had only 6 projects that were set to come out during a period of 4 years, and there were plenty of gaps in between. This ease was unavailable in the 4th phase. It was just project on top of project, and had TV shows which lasted far longer for the viewer in terms of watch time. So, when the fans didn't like one project, they'd have higher expectations for the next one set to be released. It kind of snowballed, and nothing of that much momentum was ever delivered as a conclusion. If you take a step back and think about the volume of content released during Phase 4, it won't be long before you realize that it's super messy. Since fans had high expectations, they were quick to pounce on whatever left them dissatisfied. Here's another possible factor in the decline of the MCU: streaming. It could be that the arrival of Disney Plus added to the speed with which the MCU has started falling apart. When it all first began, it was a great idea. 6 or so hour-long explorations of characters that were important yet were usually sidelined in the main movies. But following all the releases, it seems that Disney and Marvel never intended to further develop the characters they introduced. Everyone loves the 20-second post-credit scene after the usual Marvel movie, and some might find that weird, but the fans are used to it and wait for it. But that doesn't mean that the audience was willing to sit through hours of TV series just to get a post-credit scene. Plus, TV is a whole different ballgame. The movie magic doesn't directly translate to it. While on the subject of things that don't translate, MCU's VFX seems to be getting out of hand. Seriously, it's beginning to look downright ugly at times. Sure, CGI is now so good that it can often be overutilized, but sometimes it's just distracting. Picture the Egyptian jackal rising right out of the ground in Moon Knight, or the time that Doctor Strange opened a third eye. Also, the villains being reduced to skeletons in Ms. Marvel wasn't a pretty picture, and neither was the trailer for She-Hulk Attorney at Law for that matter. When it comes to Marvel, the VFX teams have come forward to say that the studio designs the projects just so that they'll end up failing. Marvel doesn't do their VFX in-house. They usually reach out to VFX studios for their projects. If you want to go by their community online, many don't want to do their projects at all because of the time constraints and unrealistic expectations. Do you know how bad it is when the movie director brings up bad CGI in their own film? Even Taika Waititi brought up a mistake in Thor: Love and Thunder. Imagine! So, from VFXing their movies to oblivion, to starting out weak right after the Endgame era, that's why the MCU is falling apart.